The air is thick with the stench of fear and desperation. Dawn is breaking on June 9th, 68 AD. Through a half-rotted wooden door you can hear a man sobbing. This is not just any man. This is the most powerful man in the known world. A man who once commanded legions, who burned cities for entertainment, who murdered his own mother. Now he sobs like a frightened child, muttering the same phrase over and over. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. This is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 5th Emperor of Rome, in his final, pathetic hours. The man who kicked his pregnant wife to death, who castrated a boy to replace her. This monster is about to die, not in glorious battle, not surrounded by loyal guards, but cowering in a freedman's hovel, too cowardly to even drive the blade into his own throat. But to understand how the most powerful man on earth came to this miserable end, we must go back to the poisoned halls of imperial power, where a teenage sociopath first tasted blood. When Nero became emperor at just 17 years old, the world held its breath. The early signs were promising. His first acts appeared to show mercy and wisdom. He reduced taxes, gave generous gifts to the people, and promised to rule according to the example of the great Augustus. When asked to sign a routine death warrant, he famously said, "How I wish I had never learned to write." But those closest to him saw the cracks in the facade. His tutor, Seneca, would later write that he dreamed of teaching Caligula again, a nightmare that proved prophetic. For while Nero spoke of mercy in public, in private he was already planning his first murder. The darkness was about to claim its first victim. The target was his stepbrother, Britannicus, the biological son of the previous emperor, Claudius, and therefore a potential rival for the throne. Britannicus was only 14, a quiet boy who had never shown any ambition for power. But in Nero's paranoid mind, his very existence was a threat. The murder was planned with meticulous care. It happened during a dinner party in the palace, surrounded by the elite of Roman society. In Roman dining, a servant would taste the food and drink for poison. Britannicus's wine was tasted and found safe, but it was served far too hot. He called for it to be cooled with water, a common practice, but the water had been treated with a fast-acting poison. The poisoner, a woman named Locusta, had also helped kill his father Claudius. As the gathered guests watched in horror, the boy took a sip and immediately began convulsing. His face turned blue, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor, his young body racked with spasms as the poison burned through his veins. Nero continued eating calmly. He remarked to the shocked dinner guests that it was merely an epileptic fit which Britannicus was known to suffer from. The boy died within minutes, foam pouring from his mouth, his limbs twisted in a final rictus of agony. Nero ordered the body removed and the dinner to continue. When someone suggested calling for doctor, the emperor replied with cold indifference, "There's no need, he's just having one of his fits." The monster was just learning to taste blood. But killing a political rival was one thing. Soon, Nero would turn his murderous intentions on the very person who gave him everything. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had schemed, seduced, and murdered to place her son on the throne of the world, and she never let him forget it. She had tasted ultimate power as the mother of the emperor, and she was not about to let it slip away. She began making demands, insisting on being consulted on all state business, demanding to sit beside Nero during official ceremonies. She was a constant, controlling shadow, a reminder that he was her creation. Nero, a teenage emperor who wanted to race chariots, perform on stage, and sleep with whomever he pleased, grew to hate her control. The breaking point came when he fell for Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful and amoral noblewoman who whispered poison in his ear, telling him he was not truly emperor as long as his mother controlled him. The young emperor decided that his mother had to die, but killing Agrippina would not be simple. She was popular with the people and the army. Worse, she had survived so many assassination attempts over the years that she had become paranoid about poison. Nero needed a method that would appear accidental. His first attempt was an engineering marvel of murderous ingenuity. He commissioned a special boat to be built for his mother, one with a collapsible cabin roof designed to crush its occupants, while making the death appear to be a tragic accident at sea. The plan was to invite Agrippina to a festival at Baiae, load her onto the boat for the return journey, and activate the mechanism once they were far from shore. On the night of the festival, Agrippina was in high spirits. She believed her son was finally showing her respect. She boarded the boat with her friend and a few servants, completely unaware that she was stepping into an elaborate death trap. As the boat moved into deeper water, the mechanism was triggered. The cabin roof, weighted with lead, came crashing down with a thunderous crack. But the plan went horribly wrong. The falling debris killed her friend instead. Agrippina, showing the survival instincts that had kept her alive through decades of imperial intrigue, threw herself overboard into the dark waters of the bay. She was an excellent swimmer, a skill that now saved her life. As the boat's crew tried to finish her off with oars and boat hooks, she swam toward shore in the darkness. Her heavy robes dragged her down, but her will to live kept her afloat. Somehow, this woman who had survived the madness of Caligula and the paranoia of Claudius pulled herself from the water and staggered to safety. When word reached Nero that his mother had survived, the young emperor flew into a panic. There could be no pretense of an accident now. Agrippina knew exactly who had tried to kill her. He had perhaps hours before she rallied her supporters and struck back. Nero turned to the admiral of the fleet, the man who designed the boat trap. "Finish it," he ordered. "Kill her tonight." Anicetus and a squad of soldiers surrounded Agrippina's villa. They found her in her bedroom, still dripping with seawater. When she saw the armed men burst through her door, she knew her time had come. But Agrippina faced her death with the dignity that had defined her life. She stood tall, looked her killers in the eye, and spoke her final words. "Strike my womb first. Let them drive their swords into the body that bore such a monster." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, but orders were orders. The blades fell again and again, hacking through flesh and bone until Agrippina the Younger lay dead in a pool of her own blood. When Nero received confirmation, his first emotion was relief. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, an act so unnatural that it transformed him from a cruel young man into something barely human. With his mother gone, the brakes were off. Nero was free to indulge his every appetite. He divorced his quiet, virtuous wife Octavia, a symbol of traditional Roman values, but divorce was not enough. He had her arrested on false charges and exiled to a remote island. Within days, he ordered her execution. Octavia was only 20 years old. Her head was cut off and brought to Rome as proof of her death, presented to his new wife, Poppaea, like a grotesque wedding gift. Then came the Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, a blaze started in the shops around the Circus Maximus. For 6 days and 7 nights the fire raged, turning the narrow streets into death traps. When the fire finally burned itself out, the devastation was almost total. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 remained intact. Ancient sources disagree about where Nero was, but the most damning account comes from Tacitus. According to this version, as the flames devoured the city, Nero climbed to a high tower and began to sing. His song was about the destruction of Troy, and he performed it with all the dramatic passion he brought to the stage. While his subjects fled for their lives, while 1,000 years of Roman history went up in smoke, their emperor treated the greatest disaster in the city's history as inspiration for his art. The people began to whisper. They remembered how quickly Nero moved to seize the burned land for his new, grandiose palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Rumors spread that Nero had ordered the fire set. He needed a scapegoat. His solution was as calculated as it was cruel. He would blame the Christians. This strange new cult made perfect targets. Nero didn't simply execute them. He turned their deaths into entertainment for the masses. In his private gardens, he had them covered in pitch and set ablaze as human torches to light his evening parties. The screams of the burning victims provided a soundtrack for the emperor's recitations of poetry. Others were sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs, torn apart while the crowd cheered. The monster was not just a murderer. He was a showman, and his cruelty knew no bounds, not even in his own home. Poppaea, the woman he had killed for, was pregnant again. During a violent argument, supposedly about his obsession with chariot racing, Nero lost his temper completely. He lashed out. The kick landed squarely in her swollen belly. Poppaea doubled over in agony, collapsing to the marble floor, her unborn child dying inside her as she bled out in front of her husband. Losing Poppaea left a void in Nero's life. It was then that he noticed Sporus. The boy was perhaps 13 or 14 years old, a slave who bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea. In the emperor's twisted mind, a plan began to form. A plan so depraved that it would shock even the jaded aristocrats of Rome. Nero ordered that Sporus be brought to him. Then he announced that the boy would be castrated. The operation was performed by the imperial physicians. They held the struggling boy down while a heated blade removed his manhood, his screams echoing through the palace. But that was only the beginning. As the boy recovered, Nero had him dressed in women's clothing, his face painted with cosmetics. When the transformation was complete, Nero announced that he would marry Sporus in a formal ceremony. The wedding was a grotesque parody. Sporus was dressed in a bride's veil and gown, and a dowry was presented. Nero began referring to Sporus as his wife, demanding others address the boy as empress. He had created a living symbol of his absolute power and utter madness, but no reign of terror can last forever. While Nero was on a year-long artistic tour of Greece, winning over 1,800 rigged competitions, the empire began to crumble. The armies on the frontiers grew tired of their emperor's behavior. The governors in the provinces began to plot. In Gaul, a revolt broke out. In Spain, a general named Galba began assembling an army and marching toward Rome. The end came suddenly, as it often does for tyrants. On June 8, 68 AD, Nero awoke to find that his personal bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard, had abandoned him during the night. The Senate, which had lived in terror of him for years, declared him a public enemy and sentenced him to death by flogging. For the first time in his life, Nero found himself truly alone. He fled the palace in disguise, a pathetic figure stumbling through the dark, accompanied only by his castrated boy bride and a few servants. He hid in the basement of a small villa outside the city, cowering like a trapped animal. As soldiers closed in, his companions urged him to take his own life, to die with a shred of Roman dignity. But Nero, the man who had ordered thousands of deaths, was a coward. He held a dagger to his own throat, but his hand trembled. He couldn't do it. "I cannot," he whimpered. "Someone must help me." As the soldiers burst into the villa, his secretary, seeing that all was lost, shoved the blade deep into his master's throat. Nero collapsed to the floor, blood gurgling from his mouth. But even as he died, his narcissism remained. With his last breath, he gasped the words that would become his epitaph. "Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me." He saw himself not as a tyrant getting what he deserved, but as a misunderstood genius whose death was a loss to all humanity. The man who had lived by violence died in terror and pain. The emperor who demanded worship died alone in a basement. The monster was finally dead. The story of Nero is a chilling reminder of how absolute power can corrupt absolutely. It shows the darkness that can flourish when one man's ego is allowed to run unchecked. What piece of dark history should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to continue digging into the hidden truths of the past, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you never miss a story.